On the morning of the 10th of January, 1954, a pilot climbing away from Rome broke off a radio message in the middle of a word. The message never resumed. About 20 minutes into the flight, his aircraft had torn itself apart as it climbed through 27,000 feet, and 35 people fell into the sea off the island of Elba. The aircraft was a de Havilland Comet. It was the most advanced airliner in the world. And within a year, 3 of them would fall out of the sky, whole one piece at a time. 2 years earlier, the Comet had been Britain's triumph. On the 2nd of May, 1952, it entered service as the first jet airliner the world had ever carried passengers on. It carried them from London toward Johannesburg above the weather, nearly twice as fast and twice as high as anything before. The country was proud of it. To fly the Comet was to step into the future, and the future wore a British name. It had first flown in the summer of 1949, and for 3 years it had been the machine that put Britain ahead of America in the air. The press called it a marvel, and passengers wrote of a cabin smoother and quieter than any propeller airliner could offer. To reach that height, it had to do something new. It had to seal its passengers inside a pressurized metal tube and inflate it over and over on every single flight. The cabin held a pressure difference of around 8 pounds on every square inch of skin. It was a higher, harder load than any airliner had ever carried. Repeated thousands of times, the frontier the Comet crossed was one almost no one on Earth fully understood. De Havilland knew the load was severe, and they did not cut corners on paper. The rules of the day asked a cabin to survive twice its working pressure. The company went further, building to 2.5 times, and proof testing to twice. By the standards of 1952, the Comet was not built carelessly. It rested on an idea called safe life. Work out how long a part could last, then retire it well before that point. The whole scheme depended on knowing the number. It was built by people who were certain they had been careful. That certainty was the flaw. The first warning came a year to the day after the Comet entered service. On the 2nd of May, 1958, Comet climbing out of Calcutta into a violent thunderstorm broke apart in the air. 43 people died. The inquiry blamed the storm and raised the possibility that the pilot had overstressed the aircraft fighting the gusts. The verdict pointed at the weather and at the dead man in the cockpit. It was the wrong place to look. The storm was real, but the aircraft that met it was already weaker than anyone knew. The fault was not in the sky over Calcutta. It was in the metal and in a quiet decision made years earlier in a test hangar in England. But no one could see that yet, and so a crew took the blame for a crack they were never told about. After the second crash off Elba, the entire Comet fleet was grounded, and de Havilland set out to fix everything imagination could suggest. They studied engine fire, control flutter, the wings, sudden decompression. They made scores of modifications to guard against every cause they could picture. Fatigue of the fuselage was not on the list. It was never considered, and so it was never fixed. Off Elba, the Navy did something new to find out why. They lowered an underwater television camera to the seabed and hunted the wreck through the murk. The search went on all summer. By the end of August, most of the aircraft had been raised from the Mediterranean and laid out piece by piece to be read. It was among the most ambitious recoveries yet attempted from the deep sea, and it was done for one reason: to find where the metal had first let go. But that reading was not finished when the pressure to fly returned. On the 23rd of March, 1954, convinced the danger had been designed out, they put the Comet back in the air. 16 days later, on the 8th of April, another Comet climbed out of Rome bound for Cairo and Johannesburg. It came apart over the Mediterranean near Naples. 21 people died. The sea there ran more than 3,000 feet deep. Almost nothing was recovered, and there could be no more pretending. The certificate of airworthiness was withdrawn. The world's first jet airliner was finished as it stood, and Britain now had to learn what it had actually built. With so little raised from Naples, the 2 Mediterranean disasters were now studied as one. What could be learned would have to be learned from Elba and from a test. The task fell to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and to its director, Sir Arnold Hall. Hall's team did something no one had attempted at this scale. They took an entire Comet fuselage, sealed it inside a tank, and drowned it in water. Then they pumped the cabin up and let it down, again and again, each cycle standing in for one flight. Water, not air, because water could not explode. If the metal gave way, the tank would simply split and be repaired, instead of killing the men who watched. The counter climbed with a patience no passenger flight could match. 1,000 flights, 2,000, 3,000, and at around 3,060 cycles, the fuselage split open. The crack began at the corner of a cutout, where a square edge gathered the whole strain of the cabin into a single point. The wreck raised off Elba told the same story. Its torn edges carried what the investigators called the unmistakable fingerprint of metal fatigue. The popular story would later say the square passenger windows were to blame. The record is more precise and more uncomfortable. On the Elba aircraft, the fracture began not at a passenger window, but at the cutout for a radio direction-finding aerial. In the tank, it began at an escape hatch. The windows were only one of many corners where the metal was asked to bear more than it could, and the holes for the rivets had been punched, not drilled. Punching left tiny ragged wounds, and around each one the stress ran to several times the load in the skin nearby. Every flight the cabin breathed in and out. Every breath, the cracks grew a fraction. Each one was far too small to see on a walk-around inspection, and there was no way then to look inside the metal for them. The aircraft had been quietly tearing itself apart from the day it first flew. To be sure, the team wired the tank fuselage with strain gauges and watched where the metal complained. The corners answered, every one of them, load after load. Here was the decision, the one made long before anyone died. To prove the cabin strong, de Havilland had first pressurized a test fuselage far beyond its ordinary load. That overpressure did something no one intended. It hardened the metal at the very corners that mattered and made them far tougher against fatigue than any cabin a passenger would ever fly. Then, on that same hardened fuselage, they ran the fatigue test. It survived 16,000 cycles, far past the 10,000 the design had promised. The test had lied, and no one could have known it. The aircraft carrying passengers had never been hardened that way. They failed not at 16,000 flights, but at one or two. The Court of Inquiry, under Lord Cohen, laid it out in early 1955. Fatigue itself was no mystery. Engineers had known of it for 100 years. What no one had settled was how to test a whole pressurized cabin for it. The rule that such a test must use a fresh, undamaged fuselage did not yet exist. It was written afterward in the years that followed, out of the metal of the dead. The lessons did not stay buried. The industry abandoned the Comet's idea that a part could simply be trusted for a fixed life and then flown without doubt. In its place came fail-safe design, structures built so that when a crack appeared, it would be caught and halted before it could open the aircraft. The rounded window every traveler now leans against is the visible edge of that lesson. De Havilland then did something rare. It published what it had learned, openly, for every rival to read. Among those who read it was Boeing. When the Comet finally returned, rebuilt and safe, in the autumn of 1958, it flew the Atlantic first, by just a few weeks. Then the Boeing 707 followed, larger and later and unburdened by the graveyard the Comet had paid to map. The years lost to the rebuild could not be bought back. Britain had been first, and it had lost the lead it died to win. 99 people died in 3 aircraft to prove a thing the industry now treats as ordinary. That metal remembers every load it has ever carried, and that a test which flatters you is worse than no test at all. Whether that knowledge was worth the price, or whether the rush to be first is what truly killed them, is the question the wreckage still asks. The Comet was not brought down by a shape. It was brought down by the certainty that it had already been proven safe.